The Man on the Clapham Omnibus. There was a time, not so many decades ago, let's say in the 1950s or possibly 1960s, when the man on the Clapham Omnibus would have felt that democracy in the United Kingdom was doing rather well. The term, the man on the Clapham Omnibus, which means the average citizen, a typical member of the British public, was used in court proceedings as far back as the Victorian era. It referred to the idea of what the average man would think of any given situation. Common sense. If this man on the Clapham Omnibus, or anywhere else for that matter, on the streets of London or any major British city in the decades immediately after the Second World War, was asked their thoughts on politicians, parliament, and the British system of government, if they had any thoughts at all, they would probably have asserted that it was a model to other countries, a system which was the envy of the world. I suspect, and indeed my suspicion will be supported by most opinion polling, that today an altogether more cynical and negative view might be held by the ordinary citizen of the UK and, indeed, across much of the democratic world. Democracies, political systems, and politicians are not held in high regard. In this podcast, I'd like to discuss how and why that has occurred. Why are terms such as participation crisis and a crisis of confidence common topics of discussion? There is a widely perceived democratic deficit, and indeed the possibility that democracy itself is facing something of an existential crisis. Let's start then with democracy. Governments derive their legitimacy, that is, the legal right to rule, exercise executive power, pass laws, etc., and their authority to do that from a number of different sources. Throughout most of human history, this has tended to be tradition or religion. Political scientists tend to categorize the exercise of government power in a similar way to the sociologist Max Weber, who describes power exercised, firstly, in a traditional manner, that is, through systems such as hereditary power or custom. He also identifies charismatic power, exercised by rulers who govern through force of their personality, persuasive ability, and direct power, or coercive power, i.e. the possession of guns, weaponry, a loyal army and police force, security services, and finally, constitutional power, of which democratic systems are an example. In British history, the emergence of constitutional systems challenged the older idea of the divine right of kings, which held that kings ruled by authority granted from God. During the European Enlightenment, the 17th and 18th centuries, writers such as Rousseau, John Locke, and Thomas Hobbes described the principle of the social contract, in which government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. The contract is formed when citizens consent to be governed in exchange for good government, protection, and the recognition of rights. Unlike most contracts, such a system is formed out of rules or laws, both written and unwritten, which form a constitution. Such constitutions describe the rights of citizens, the limits and extent of power, and how they might be exercised, as well as the structure and institutions involved, such as the executive, judiciary, and legislature. To obtain and maintain consent, and thereby grant governments a right to rule, often described as their mandate, elections are based on the principle that governments must, in order to rule, obtain the consent of a majority, or at least a large proportion of the adult population. While democracy has very early origins, most famously in the city-state of Athens in the 3rd century BCE, it is, for the most part, a relatively recent development. On the 11th of November 1947, the leader of the opposition, Winston Churchill, spoke in the House of Commons in response to the then Labour government's plan to curb the House of Lords' ability to delay legislation. He said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time." In this famous observation, Churchill identified one explanation for why democracy arrived so late in human history, and why it is still not universal. He implied that democracy is messy, difficult to sustain, and flawed. No greater evidence is required than the current occupant of the White House. Decolonizing democracy. If the man on the Clapham omnibus rode to work or home in the early 1960s, he would have witnessed the dismantling of the British Empire. From the end of the Second World War until the mid-1960s, Britain withdrew from Africa and Asia, and the winds of change brought democracy, often in a parliamentary model, to many African and Asian states. There had been former colonies. As an afterthought, the British, shortly before lowering the flag over their colonial possessions, attempted to construct democracies in their own image. Structures were hastily imposed on former colonies, as the British carried out a fig leaf operation, claiming that British culture during the colonial period left a legacy of democracy, implying to some degree that this had been the object of the exercise and a necessary and inevitable conclusion. The historical record in Africa shows that most of the former British colonies were unable to sustain the multi-party democracy they inherited and quickly collapsed into authoritarian or single-party states. As the fragile democracies left behind by the retreating British Empire failed in Nigeria, Sudan, Kenya, Uganda and Zimbabwe, the Western press and many academics wrung their hands and lamented how these countries were not yet ready for such a delicate and subtle gift. A paternalistic view used to justify imperial dominance. However, post-colonial analysis offers an alternative view. Political philosophers, such as Ferit Güven, argue that liberal democracy has consistently failed to acknowledge the legacy of the colonial state apparatus, which was fundamentally designed for coercion and resource extraction. Under colonial administrations, little thought was given or even the possibility acknowledged to future democracies and how they might be prepared for. The imperialist enterprise was essentially a system for enriching the European centres of colonial power. This re-evaluation is sometimes called the decolonizing of democracy, and it has prompted a reassessment of democracy itself, especially its Western-oriented parliamentary multi-party liberal form. Certainly, the one-size-fits-all institutional framework left by colonizers expected developing nations to conform to a Western narrative that was presented as superior and imbued with the concept of civilization. Instead, post-colonial analysis calls for democratizing democracy and the recognition of diverse ways and pathways that integrate local traditions, consensus, and cultural plurality. Countries like Bolivia and Ecuador have rewritten their constitutions to recognize the state as plurinational, formalizing indigenous legal systems and giving rights to nature. The Ship of Fools. One of the oldest critiques of democracy is found in Plato's works, where he asks a simple question. If you are on a ship, would you prefer the passengers or the crew to navigate? This is the flaw of democracy, or one of them at least, and it can be easily understood by anyone who reflects that popularity and being popular are not always the best indicators of expertise or suitability for responsibility. Another observation by Churchill is often cited, that the best argument against democracy, he said, is 5 minutes conversation with the average voter. Studies of voting behavior indicate that people vote the way they do for many complex reasons and are influenced by short-term, long-term, cultural, traditional, personal, superficial, and thoughtful motivations. Well-known aspects of human psychology, including groupthink, crowd behavior, and the observed actions of crowds and mobs, suggest to us the irrational possibilities of human action. Our personal experiences show how we can be influenced by persuasion or guided by irrational beliefs. Just as it is often noted that the most dangerous component in an aircraft is the pilot, human beings are notoriously emotional creatures. Though we might hope that every voter shows up at the ballot box having thoughtfully reasoned what might be best for themselves and their fellow citizens, we know this is not the case. In the Federalist Papers, a series of essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison and John Jay, that argue for the adoption of the American Constitution, the case is made that the Constitution is a sufficient safeguard against dictatorship, both from the individual dictator and from the tyranny of the majority. In Federalist Paper No. 1, Alexander Hamilton warns against the hobby horse of popularity, and in Federalist Paper 10, James Madison warned of the dangers of popular passion, particularly to minorities and minority views. The founders of the American Constitution widely understood that the first president would be a man highly regarded and respected, George Washington. They also recognized that future presidents, and indeed all future politicians, might not be of the same caliber. Few observations could be more prescient than the one made by the satirist Ch.L. Mencken in 1920. He observed, "As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. We move toward a lofty ideal. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron." The age-old dangers of directly exercising the popular will of the majority might well also be illustrated by the use of referenda and popular opinion polls and plebiscites as mechanisms for government, which have not always proved to make the best or most rational choices. It also helps to explain why direct democracy is not the standard model of democracy as it evolved in Europe and indeed across the world. The commonest form of democracy is representative democracy. Representative democracy acts as the great filter for popular passion. Since the electorate doesn't generally elect the government directly, but instead elects an intermediate body of representatives who then elect the government themselves in parliamentary systems, these intermediate representative bodies also serve as legislators, making laws, a function that keeps lawmaking out of the direct and immediate power of the executive or government. You can see that in this dual function, a legislature which both provides and legitimizes the government, representative democracy is trying to address a problem inherent in democracy itself. The power exercised by those chosen by popular opinion can be dangerous, so it should be divided, modified, and at least insulated from the immediate passions of the population at large. In the UK, this intermediate body is Parliament. In France, it is the National Assembly. In Germany, it is the Reichstag, and so on. All of these are parliamentary systems. The United States is a notable exception to the parliamentary system, which is, by far, the most common form of representative democracy. Instead, under its presidential system, the president is directly elected and not dependent on the legislature, thereby removing the legislature's function as the selector of the chief executive. However, to address the concern that the people are not always the best instrument for choosing the executive, the Americans created the Electoral College, which can be understood as performing the same function that parliaments do in selecting governments. In its original formation, the Electoral College was designed by the United States founding fathers to serve as an intermediate body between the people and the selection of the executive. Originally, the college would have comprised the wise and experienced individuals who were thought to be better at selecting the president than the broader mass of the population. Selection of the president by elites, no matter how educated they may be, or be thought to be, fell out of favour. Increasingly, confidence was placed in the people of the United States to exercise their presidential selecting powers through popular elections. Initially, increased confidence resulted from experimentation, as some states adopted popular votes without major disastrous effect. Later, it reflected an understanding of higher literacy levels and a greater need to give the president popular authority. Today, the Electoral College, except for a few rare individual cases, follows the popular vote. The great flaw of representative democracy is that it undermines the unalloyed claim governments make to have a mandate from the people. Systems that insert an intermediate body between the people and the selection of government are liable to be accused of undermining democracy itself. To understand this, it is only necessary to note that in the United Kingdom, very few governments can accurately claim to reflect the overall majority support of the electorate. Victory in a UK general election generally goes to the party that secures just over 40% of the vote, ranging from a high of 49.7 in 1955 to a historic low of 33.7 in 2024. It should also be noted that this represents 40% of those who voted, not the overall electorate. The share of the total electorate gained by winning governments in the UK has averaged roughly 33.3% since the Second World War, peaking at 41.3 in 1951 and hitting a historic low of 20.2 in 2024. Since the Second World War, the largest party in the House of Commons, and therefore the party forming the government, has had fewer votes than its immediate opposition on two occasions. This occurred in 1951 and in 1974. And recently, the Electoral College in the United States has similarly delivered victorious presidents to the White House who have won fewer popular votes than their opponents. That a little over 20% of the UK electorate supported the government elected in 2024, despite its overwhelming parliamentary majority, points to another problem with democracy. This is generally called the democratic deficit. Term democratic deficit originated in the 1970s within the context of European integration. It was used to describe the lack of democratic legitimacy and accountability in the institutions of the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the modern European Union. While it was originally used to criticize the institutions of the European Union, its meaning has broadened to encompass a general criticism of democracy, especially in the UK. Essentially, it means that in the UK, democracy is insufficiently democratic. There isn't enough democracy in our system. When Gordon Brown took over from Tony Blair as Prime Minister in the summer of 2007, almost his first act was to publish a green paper. That's the discussion document that precedes a white paper or the detailed outline of a policy. The green paper was entitled The Governance of Britain, which took as its starting point the declining public trust in the democratic process. Action is now needed across the breadth of the political system. The Green Paper essentially argued that this was necessary to promote and restore trust in politics and our political institutions. Evidence of a democratic deficit typically includes the shortcomings of the first-past-the-post system and its disproportionate representation of results. An unelected House of Lords, an unelected head of state, weak local government institutions, and the concentration of power in Westminster. More broadly, the criticism can be aimed at institutions such as trade unions and their opaque democratic structures, somewhat opaque political funding, as well as their resistance to modern voting methods. The democratic deficit can also be used to encompass pressure groups, which wield significant influence yet lack accountability. Insider pressure groups with privileged access to policymaking, groups backed by corporate interests, and those that employ undemocratic methods of civil disruption are all examples of a democratic deficit, as power and influence are exercised disproportionately. It might also point to the limited use of direct democracy in the UK, such as referendums, consultative panels, and other forms of consultation. The democratic deficit might also be aimed at the media, which, to a large part, is controlled by wealthy, unaccountable business interests. For example, the powerful Murdoch Group has owned several British newspapers simultaneously, including The Times, The Sunday Times, and The Sun. The print versions of the leading national newspapers remain wedded to highly partisan approaches to covering UK politics and elections. All of these broadly suggest that there is a disconnect between influence, power, and democratic accountability. The counter-argument to the democratic deficit emphasizes that democracy is not always the optimal decision-making tool. Referendums, for example, attract specific criticism, and direct democracy methods are often significantly flawed. Disproportionate media influence, popular misconceptions, panics, and conspiracy theories all make direct democracy a potentially hazardous enterprise. Consultative mechanisms, such as citizens' panels and citizens' councils, can be a sham or involve self-selected groups. Other arguments suggest that there have been significant reforms, sometimes slow and steady, such as the extension of the franchise to 16-year-olds in Scotland and the planned extension of the franchise across the rest of the UK. The accepted use of referendums for significant constitutional change in the UK. Plans for a democratically elected or appointed House of Lords. A trend towards greater openness through data protection laws, the Freedom of Information Act, and more explicit rights protection in the Human Rights Act. In the UK, devolution has created parliaments in Scotland, Wales, elected mayors across the country, and an elected assembly in London, as well as a highly democratic proportional system in Northern Ireland. The process of devolution continues, transferring greater powers to metropolitan mayors in the UK. The media landscape now features a far greater plurality of voices and is no longer dominated by the legacy media. Political parties and trade unions have increasingly embraced democratic processes. One example is the principle of one member, one vote in the Labour Party, and the inclusion of all party members in the selection of leaders in all the major British parties. At its heart, democracy is a participatory system. It depends on people giving their consent as part of the social contract. Governments derive their authority and legitimacy from the electorate's consent. If election turnouts are low, this consent and legitimacy can be undermined. Although democracy has many flaws, one of its strengths is its potential to bind and heal society. Democracy can foster social cohesion and overcome class, ethnic, and religious divisions when people feel properly represented. High turnouts are generally seen as a sign of a healthy democracy and a unified, cohesive, strong society. Conversely, elections that are perceived as unfair and unrepresentative can exacerbate social divisions. Low turnouts can indicate that the public has lost faith in the electoral process. In the UK, evidence shows that turnout in general elections has declined significantly since the end of the Second World War. This decline happened in two distinct phases: a period of sustained high turnout from 1945 to 1997, followed by a sharp, historic drop reaching a low point in 2001. Since then, turnout in elections has stabilised, but has never fully recovered. Turnout has become highly unequal. Data from the Electoral Reform Society indicates that participation remains strong among older, wealthier demographics, but is substantially lower among younger and lower-income voters. Long-term trends in declining party identification and the fracturing of the old two-party system have eroded the bonds that once propelled people to the ballot box. As the low turnout among young people suggests, there is a high degree of political disillusionment with the system as a whole. While some theorize that low turnouts indicate general satisfaction, the especially low turnout among the young in recent years suggests cynicism and disillusionment rather than satisfaction. This disillusionment with the political system may also stem from the first-past-the-post voting system used in British general elections, which makes very few seats truly competitive. As a result, the outcome is highly predictable in most constituencies, which doesn't encourage people to take the time to vote. Turnout fell sharply in 2024 to 59.9%. This was the second lowest general election turnout in over a century, coming agonizingly close to the absolute historic low of 59.4 in 2001. Over a third of the eligible electorate, roughly 16 million people, simply chose not to participate. Turnout in local and devolved elections is even lower. Devolved elections usually attract around 45 to 55% of voters, and local council elections average between 30 and 35. Further evidence of a participation crisis can be found in the membership of political parties. In the 1950s, the Conservatives had an estimated 2.5 million members, and with its affiliated membership in the trade unions, the Labour Party could claim to be larger than the Soviet Union's Communist Party. Today, the young Conservative organisation has been consigned to history, and membership of the major political parties has declined dramatically, with the combined membership across all major UK political parties represents less than 2% of the total electorate. The membership of political parties, particularly the Conservatives in the UK, are drawn from an older demographic. To counter this evidence, it's often suggested that participation has changed rather than declined. In other words, people participate differently. Evidence for this can be found in the proliferation of organisations, both in number and variety, such as pressure groups, think tanks, and broad popular movements. Over half of all promotional and cause-based pressure groups currently active in the UK were formed after 1960. Driven by the internet and evolving social causes, there are over 90,000 registered non-party groups, charities and voluntary associations active across the UK. The National Trust stands as the largest voluntary organisation in Europe, boasting over 3.4 million members. Similarly, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB, has over 1 million members, dwarfing the combined membership of every major UK political party. People are less motivated by old party loyalties based on class, locality, and personal identity. And they've lost faith in broad ideologies that have become fragmented and less convincing in this post-ideological age. However, causes and issues can still motivate, as was suggested in a recent by-election. In July 2026, a by-election was held in Makerfield, carrying an unusual significance. The Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, had indicated that if successful, he would challenge for the role of Prime Minister and the leadership of the Labour Party. The by-election was also seen as a significant test for the electoral credibility of the Reform Party. Because of its significance, the by-election in Makerfield attracted national media attention, prompting much speculation and discussion about its possible implications, outcome, and results. As a result, Makerfield had a 71% turnout, making it one of the highest for by-elections since the Second World War. Opinion polls suggest that people care deeply about the environment and climate change, and are highly motivated by injustices such as those perpetrated in Gaza, as well as a generalized loathing of Donald Trump. Participation in pressure group activities and membership organizations can sometimes involve little more than paying a membership fee, requiring far less commitment of time and participation. This is sometimes derided as checkbook participation or slacktivism, since it involves little more than clicking a thumbs up on an internet page. However, it is also true that at the height of British National Political Party membership, many millions of people, such as the Young Conservatives or the Working Men's Associations, joined for social and community reasons that may have had little to do with politics. Was voting motivated by obedience to class or neighbourhood identity any less perfunctory than the myriad considerations that people employ when voting today? A golden age of mass political participation, which reflected the politically engaged and energised electorate, is therefore largely a myth. Power of politicised consumerism should also not be underestimated as a new form of participation. Over 70% of the UK population now engages in political consumerism, using their wallets to boycott unethical brands or support climate causes. According to the UK activist organisation Palestine Solidarity Campaign, in 2022, coffee chain Pret, which had signed a franchise agreement with Israel-based companies and committed to opening 40 stores in Israel, dropped the plan after a publicity campaign and a threatened boycott. These kinds of ethical sensibilities among consumers are, of course, well understood by the marketing departments and public relations people of large corporations, who are not averse to a bit of greenwashing or virtue signalling. A participation crisis, which is used to mean that traditional, formal politics, such as voting and political party membership, are rapidly declining or being rejected, and this decline threatened to rob representative governments of their democratic legitimacy, first appeared as a topic of academic discussion in the 1960s and 70s. This analysis of the participation crisis reflected mid-20th century fears corresponding with a decline in the certainties and optimism of modernism, the fragmentation of shared cultural narratives, and disillusionment among especially the young in response to events such as the Vietnam War, and the continued existence of atomic weapons. Writers such as Jürgen Habermas began a long tradition of academic analysis that identified an existential crisis in democracy itself. Since this discussion, the predicted imminent demise of democracy has been forecast for more than half a century. The term participation crisis now seems less predictive and more an ongoing feature of democracy itself. It may be that those who observed declining turnouts, shrinking party membership, and a rejection of mainstream centrist politics missed something. What they may have missed is that democracy endures because of its imperfection. This might be termed functional legitimacy. People will accept a system flawed, imperfect, disproportionate, or downright arbitrary if its rules are understood and agreed to. The losing parties in the 1951 and 1974 elections received more popular votes than the winning parties in the UK, similar to the way in which Hillary Clinton and Al Gore lost presidential elections despite obtaining more votes than the winners, Donald Trump and George Bush. And yet, this most egregious failure in democracy received little more than hand-wringing and complaints that the voting system or the electoral college might need to be altered. But no such alteration took place. Governments and presidents carried on, exercising executive power and passing laws nonetheless. An analogy could be a decision-making system as arbitrary as tossing a coin, if it is accepted by its participants. No claim is made about its rationality. The participants accept its outcome as random. In this sense, if the rules are understood, even a flawed system can function. Turnout in American primaries, local elections, British local elections, and devolved elections is extremely low, with most voters satisfied to watch the results without participating. This suggests that democratic processes can operate when there is a broad understanding of the rules, even if turnouts are low. However, it may also be the case that those who predict a demise in democracy might have been better off focusing on areas other than participation. Rather than debating whether modern democracies are genuinely broken due to low voter turnout, or if participation has simply evolved into informal methods like e-petitions, social movements, and ethical consumerism, the discussion should focus more on the growing significance of politicians and parties that challenge the democratic system altogether. Authors such as Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in How Democracies Die, Tyranny of the Minority, argue that modern democracies rarely face sudden military coups. Instead, they are slowly hollowed out when elected leaders weaponize legal systems and break the unspoken political norms. Clearly, they've got Donald Trump in mind, among others. Anne Applebaum, in Twilight of Democracy in 2020, and Autocracy Incorporated, describes how elite political circles in the US, UK, and Europe have turned towards illiberalism, lured by authoritarian tactics and sophisticated disinformation networks. New forms of communication have made misleading the public even more effective. Yasha Monk, in The People versus Democracy, 2018, suggests a growing divide between liberalism, rights and the rule of law, and democracy, the will of the people, resulting in systems that represent voters poorly. C. Grayling, in Democracy and Its Crisis, 2017, argues that modern representative systems have been hijacked by dark money, targeted digital advertising, and populist rhetoric, rendering old constitutional checks inadequate. Again, it's likely that Trump figures highly in this analysis. These authors, among others, pursue a common theme: the rise of populism, authoritarian regimes, and the re-emergence of the radical right and ideological polarization generally. The rise of authoritarian populism shows that we can no longer assume that liberal democracy has an inevitable future. The writer and academic David Runciman argues in How Democracy Ends that long-term structural changes threaten democracy. An aging population, increasing apathy, and institutions that are widely seen as unable to reflect the diversity of opinion in the population or to meet the desire for greater active forms of participation. Changes in information technology have challenged democracy by dismantling the traditional gatekeepers of public information and replacing them with algorithmic models that value user engagement over objective truth. Decisions regarding content moderation, free speech, boundaries, and algorithm design are made in corporate boardrooms, completely isolated from democratic accountability. Nobel Peace Prize recipient Maria Ressa warned of the tearing down of shared reality as the greatest threat to democracy. It may be that rather than fearing declining participation, the real danger is participation itself, which threatens democracy. The mob that stormed Congress was not lacking political motivation. In fact, they were far from apathetic. They were highly charged and politically extremely assertive. If tomorrow afternoon it were revealed that an illegal immigrant had murdered a child somewhere in the UK, it could well result in crowds on the streets and attacks on the police. In this sense, the participation crisis is not a lack of participation, but misdirected participation. This has been a podcast from the Politics Shed. Use the Politics Shed website for more information. Thank you for listening.